Good morning, good afternoon, and namaste. Welcome to a special session of NICE on NATO's prospect, a troubled future, question mark. The 2024 NATO summit is currently taking place in Washington, D.C. from July 9th to 11th, marking the 75th anniversary of the alliance. This significant event is being attended by leaders from all 32 NATO member countries, as well as key partners. Support for Ukraine is one of the major agenda. The summit aims to deepen cooperation with partners in the Indo-Pacific region, including Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. It is in this context we have invited Professor Amit Gupta, Senior Advisor to Forum of Federation, Ottawa, Canada, to talk on NATO's prospect and its future. We'd also like to apologize that we had not shared the updated bio of Professor Gupta in some of your invitations. Before I start, let me introduce Professor Gupta formally. Professor Amit Gupta is a Senior Advisor for the Forum of Federation, Ottawa, Canada. He was an associate professor at the United States Air Force War College. His research has focused on international security issues, demography, and popular culture and politics. His article has been published in Orbis, Asian Survey, Security Dialogue Prism, and the International Journal of History of Sports, and the Roundtable, the Commonwealth Journal of International Affairs, and several others. He has written a research report for the Forum of Reintegrating Armed Groups in Yemen. He is also the author or editor of 7 books, the most recent of which are Air Power, The Next Generation, published by Howgate Publishing in 2020, and Maritime Heritage and Challenges in the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific, published by Routledge in 2018. Professor Gupta, once again, welcome to NICE, and thank you for your valuable time. Please make your remarks in 20-30 minutes, which will be followed by questions and answers. Professor Gupta, over to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Pramod. It's always nice to talk to NICE. And let me start by saying this. Perhaps saying NATO is a bit constricting because what we're really talking about is the West. Okay? Because the Western countries get into this sort of bureaucratic distinctions of NATO, EU, Western Alliance, AUKUS, so on. But in some ways, the mindset, the global vision is the same. So what I'm going to talk about is the Western global vision, which is also the NATO global vision. And here's what you have to recognize in all this. NATO starts as a defensive unit in Europe because the West European countries realize they cannot on their own keep out the Russians or the Soviets then. And as Lord Ismay of Britain said, the idea of NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans in their place, or the Germans down. And it worked really well. Post-Cold War, NATO becomes an extra-regional organization. And you start seeing NATO contingents going to Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, so on. And there is more and more talk about NATO as a global security order. Of course, basically the foundation of which is the United States of America. Now, there's several things you have to realize when you look at this NATO organization and its plans. And I'll show some slides on this in a minute. But the first thing to keep in mind is that NATO in itself cannot function without the United States for several reasons. First, all the populations of Europe are getting older, rapidly older, and you do not have manpower to use for waging wars. Second, the NATO countries have taken the peace dividend since 1991, and all the way up to 2022, they kept slashing military budgets. And let me give you some examples of how this played out. In Libya, NATO ran out, or the European part of NATO ran out of precision-guided munitions. So the Americans had to supply those munitions, and countries like Norway, Denmark became air powers because they had American F-16s on which American missiles could be put. The Europeans promised after the Libyan conflict that they would build up their military capability. They didn't. And even today, over 2/3 of the NATO countries, or close to 2/3, are still not at the minimum required 3% of GDP. Though, as I will argue, you need to be closer to 4% of GDP. So that's the second problem. The third problem is it's a will to fight. If you go and read what comes out of different European nations, and I, in the last 2 years, for example, have gone to universities in Britain, Netherlands, Belgium, and Portugal, and I've always asked this question of students. Could you please tell me how many of you would fight if there was a war? Especially how many of you would be willing to go to Ukraine? And the answer promotes to all that was zero. Nobody wanted to go and fight. So what exactly is this military alliance if you can't get soldiers? So essentially what happens is by about 2016, Trump has come in and Trump is looking at this and he's making an argument which the American right wing makes and which is quite a logical argument, which is the Europeans don't pay their fair share. We, the Americans, spend a lot of money keeping troops in Europe. Why not bring those troops home and keep them in American bases, where the money is A, gets reduced, but B, they're spending their dollars in the American economy and not the European economy. And this, of course, scares the living daylights out of the Europeans. And NATO is essentially headed towards not oblivion, but increasing irrelevance until what happens is Ukraine. And Ukraine comes about, and all of a sudden, on both sides of the Atlantic, people start cheering and saying, the West is back. We will work together and we will stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine, etc., etc. And they start giving money. And if you can, I'm going to now share my slides, okay? Just so that you can take a look at this. And hit share. There we go. It's, let me get to the one which really matters in this. Okay. Is this one? Yeah. Look, actually one back, sorry. Yeah. Here we go. Look, the thing to remember about NATO and Ukraine is it's a hugely expensive process fighting the war in Ukraine. Between the United States and NATO, they've given about $300 billion to the Ukrainians. There are very few countries in the world that can have that much of a budget to fight a war. And you're going to see the same thing when you talk about Gaza. The other thing which is interesting in this is because NATO went and shrank its military capabilities, it has had real trouble in giving weaponry to Ukraine. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Ukraine says it needs 4 to 7 million artillery shells a year. The United States only produces 360,000, and it'll go up to 1.2 million in 2025. Where will the rest come from? And the Europeans say they will put in another million. But what Denmark did, which essentially proves to me that NATO lacks capability, is that they gave their entire reserve of 15,000 shells very proudly to Ukraine and said, see, we've completely removed everything from our reserves and given them to you. Here's what the audience needs to keep in mind. 15,000 artillery shells is 36 hours of firing for the Ukrainians. What happens on the third day? And the answer is nobody knows. Similarly, the Ukrainians need 1,800 Patriot missiles. The US produces 550. It's going to go up to 650. Still far less than what Ukraine needs. And I should add, we don't know what the requirements for Israel are going to be in the next year or so. Add to this one more thing, because what you see in Ukraine mirrors what you will see in the rest of Europe. The average, excuse me, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier is 43. And war is a young man's game. If you look at the US Marine Corps, the US Marine Corps, 75% of it is between 18 and 25. There is a reason for that. 43-year-old men may be willing fighters, but they're not as effective as young men are because of the physical hardships involved in conflict. Now, that's one part of this. The other part of this, as they sit in Washington, D.C. and talk about all this, is really how much can NATO build up? And if you see the slide which I've put up, can you see it properly, by the way?
Yes, sir. You can see it.
Do you want me to put it on slideshow or is it okay?
It's perfect, sir.
Okay, good. Thank you. Look, the official number of Ukrainian war dead is 31,000. Most people think it's a lot higher. Now look at Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. These are the three big military nations of Europe. The British only have 79,000 soldiers now. If they lost 31,000 soldiers in a war, they would lose 40% of their army. The French have 114,000. They would again lose about 30% of their army. The Germans would lose about half their army. The Italians would lose again about 35% of their army. In other words, none of these countries have the military capability that they would require to wage a serious war. And just to give you an idea of Germany, because everybody's read about Olaf Scholz saying, here's 100 billion euro to the German military. You look at the number of German aircraft now. There's 226 as of 2023. Maybe about 100, 125 are operational. The rest are mothballed. And what Schultz has said is, we want to use this 100 billion to bring what we have mothballed back into operation. It's the same thing with tanks. The Germans in the Cold War had 2,000 Leopard tanks. They're down to 311, only 95 were operational. So that 100 billion is going to bring 200 Leopard tanks back into service. It's not to take Germany back to 2,000 tanks, which they had in, let's say, 1972. The other thing is none of these countries have conscription anymore. Sweden has conscription. But the bottom line is, where are you going to find the young people to go and fight? And that's reflected in the low numbers who are in the military now for all these countries. So when you keep this in mind, the ability of NATO to fight and wage war is really questionable. And whatever they may promise in Washington, D.C., at the end of the day, that would require huge budgetary choices, because with an aging population, as NATO has, the money has to go to healthcare. And you look at the recent election in Britain, where Keir Starmer won for two reasons. He said, I will improve infrastructure, and try moving around on public transport in Britain and you'll see what I mean. And he said, I will improve the National Health Service, which is of huge concern to British citizens because they are an aging population. Where does the money come for defense then? And what have the British done? If you look at AUKUS, which is this thing that a lot of people believe will be transforming the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific, the British sent the aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth into the Indo-Pacific, and close to probably 60% of the aircraft on it were from the Royal Air Force. The Navy does not have enough money to stack its own aircraft carrier with its own jets. It has to borrow them. And those were taken back. So now it's essentially floating around with a depleted complement. So this is the real problem for NATO. The money isn't there, the will to fight isn't there. And essentially, if the Americans pull out, and Trump has talked about this, what happens to Europe then? And I think the British elections were a harbinger of what the future is going to be. People are going to say, yeah, defense is all right. This idea that somehow Europe is a world power and we are going to influence events in the Indo-Pacific is great, but we like healthcare, we like education, so on. Now, the great tragedy in all this is Ukraine. And let me say this. What has happened to Ukraine are two things. One is a demographic disaster. The other is an economic disaster. and NATO will not look after either of them. When Ukraine became an independent country in 91, 92, it had a population of 51 million. When the war started, the official Ukrainian population was 44 million. Today, according to the US Census Bureau, it is 35 million. 9 million people have fled the country. And the original estimate was Ukraine's population would reach 35 million in 2050. It's already there, 25 years before it should have. And now the official estimate is it will reach 30 million. And if you look at this slide, look at the bottom left-hand corner where it shows population, and you can see the downward trend of the Ukrainian population. Because what you've seen is young men, young women leaving the country. And increasingly, when I talk to people in Europe, academics, they say the trend for the young women is they're marrying locally. So they're marrying in Poland, they're marrying in the Netherlands, they're marrying wherever they are. That means they're not going to go back. That means you won't be replenishing the population base of Ukraine. Now, let me show you why this becomes problematic. This is what a normal population pyramid looks like. This is India in 2024. And for those of you who have never seen a population pyramid before, on the left-hand side are the men, on the right-hand side are the women. And the bottom bar is newly born babies to the age of 4. The second bar is children from 5 to 10, and so on. It goes all the way up to 100 or whatever the number is. And what you can see in the Indian case is two things. One, there's a very large base of young people. Young people give you a workforce. Young people give you a fighting force. Young people have initiative. Remember, both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were in their 20s when they created Apple and Microsoft. 60-year-old men don't make Apple and Microsoft. Innovation comes from the young. But there is another thing which is problematic here. If you look at this chart, you can see very clearly there are more young men than there are young women in India. And that's a demographic problem which the Indians are going to face. Now, compare this with Ukraine. This is Ukraine in 2024. And if you look at Ukraine in 2024, two things jump out when you look at the population pyramid. Firstly, there are very few young people. Look at the birth rate of children in the age of 0 to 4. It's under 500,000 women and girls and 500,000 boys. The bulk of the Ukrainian population comes between 35 and 45, and then again between 60 and 70. You cannot send 70-year-old men and women to war. 70-year-old men and women don't do innovation. And just to take this one step further, because 2050 is the year that everybody's talking about, this is the population pyramid in 2050 for Ukraine. And when you look at that, look at where the bulk of the population is. The bulk of the population is now between 60 and 70. It is an aging population. And that number of 30 million may be much lower because of the next problem that I'm going to bring up. And the next problem, well, refugee flows I've talked about here, is the Ukraine building costs, rebuilding. See, everybody in the West loves the idea of giving people money to fight. Nobody in the West seriously gives people money to rebuild. Go ask the Cambodians how much money they got to rebuild, the Vietnamese, the Afghans. I can go down the list on people who waged major wars and then had to suffer the consequences. These are the estimates for rebuilding Ukraine. The World Bank says very clearly in 2023 that it'll cost $411 billion. That goes up in 2024 to $468 billion. Zelensky says it's $700 billion. And $700 billion would be about $30 billion a year for 25 years, 22 years. You do the math. Nobody is going to do that, give that kind of money once the Ukraine war is over, because sadly, people will forget Ukraine. And if you don't give that money, you don't rebuild the infrastructure, you don't rebuild the roads, you don't rebuild the hospital systems, and so on, all you'll see is a greater migration of population. This is the part of this war, and this is the role of NATO that I have problems with, that nobody's talking about post-reconstruction. I mean, they have some kind of talk. The other thing to close on Ukraine is you have to be very, very careful at looking at these numbers too. What a lot of these countries have done is they've said, I have a 30-year-old tank. Today, I bought it for, let's say, $500,000. Today, it's worth $3 million. So that's a $3 million transfer to the Ukrainians. No, it isn't. You're giving an old piece of junk to them to fight a war. That's the first part in this. The second part in this is to look at what some people have given. The Portuguese gave 3 tanks to Ukraine. And they were Leopard ones, which are old tanks. But the funny part in this is they said, we will give the 3 tanks if Germany agrees to maintain all our tanks. So we don't have to pay the bill. And by all their tanks, I mean the tanks in Portugal. These are the kinds of bizarre deals that are being cut across Europe right now to fund the war effort and to prop up the Ukrainians. Now, if this is the case, what about the future of NATO? And let me be very clear about this. If NATO wants to be a serious military power, it needs to have 4% of GDP. And remember, some of these countries that have 3% of GDP already, like Latvia, Estonia has 1.6 million people. So tell me, what is the 3% GDP of 1.6 million people? The answer is not much. The Germans are at 2.5%. The Spanish are at maybe 2.2%. People are a long way away from meeting the basic number. But to go to a capable defense force, you're going to have to spend 4% of GDP. But then you have to start cutting welfare, which is old age pensions, healthcare, education, and watch the primal scream that comes out of Europe when that happens. The second part to it is, unless you reintroduce conscription, you do not get the military manpower to fight a war. What you will get are 40-year-old men, 50-year-old men fighting for them. So what you have is a problem of resources, a problem of resilience, and a problem of essentially finding the bodies that are willing to fight. And on all three, I don't see much happening in NATO. I can talk about the United States separately if you like. I'll end by saying this. The problem for NATO, EU, the West, call it what you may, is it had one huge asset which has been destroyed between Ukraine and Gaza, and that was its soft power. Remember, the West used to talk about the rules-based international order. The West used to talk about human rights. The West used to talk about liberty, freedom, so on. What happened with Ukraine? In the UN General Assembly, 35 countries abstained on the resolution to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And those 35 countries constitute 4.4 billion of the world's population, which means the majority of the world's population said, we're not condemning the Russians. And yes, 1.4 billion were Indians, 1.4 billion were Chinese. That still leaves 1.6 billion, which is greater than the combined population of Europe and North America, which is the Western world order, rules-based international order creators. That is the first one. And people in the people in Washington, D.C., who look at policy issues said, we need to understand why this happened. Because all of a sudden, the world order we'd established since unipolarity is starting to see major cracks in it. Second one is Gaza. And look, on Gaza, 2 resolutions were put before the UN General Assembly. One was an American-supported one which said condemn Hamas and have a ceasefire. That one didn't pass. The one which passed was a resolution which was put forward by Jordan, which is a small country. And the Jordanian resolution made no mention of condemning Hamas. The Jordanian resolution said we call for an immediate ceasefire. 121 countries voted for it, 10 voted against it, and 12, which included India and Australia, courageously abstained. So what you have to see is military power is questioned, soft power is questioned, and that comes to the last part in this puzzle, which is economic power. And again, everybody in Europe keeps talking about European economic power, American economic power. Let's put this in perspective. Two things should be kept in mind. First, if you take the combined GDP of China, Japan, and South Korea, it is 30% more than the combined GDP of the European Union. And you can add in the British, it may be 25% then. But still, the future is in Asia. And the IMF did a study last year where they said 66% of global growth is now in Asia. The other 33% is Africa, Europe, North and South America. If this is the case, what is happening with economic power? What is happening with military power? What is happening with soft power? And my answer to you is the old construct, which came out of NATO as a security provider, a rules-based international order, et cetera, and of course the dollar as the accepted currency of international trade. All of this is coming under challenge. And what is emerging is a new world order. And it'll be interesting to see where this comes about. So I'll end by saying this very quickly. I'm a NATO pessimist. I think NATO is on life support because nobody can pay to keep this grandiose experiment going. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for your remarks. It was really interesting, very comprehensive. We have received lots of questions, so without wasting much time, let me share some of the questions with you. First is that how should the situation... Yes.
Could you put up your volume, please? Just a little bit.
Sure, sure.
Thank you.
Sorry. We have received lots of questions. The first is that how should the situation be interpreted where the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is visiting Moscow during the NATO summit focused on Ukraine, especially given the expressed displeasure of Ukrainian President Zelensky?
He wants to know what the Indian position is, or he wants to know, or she wants to know
how do you look at this situation when there is NATO summit on the one side aimed at Russia, on the other side the Indian Prime Minister is visiting
okay,
Moscow.
got it. All right. Thank you. Look, here's the thing. India cannot break with Russia. India gets technology from Russia. India has been getting cheap oil and has become a major oil exporter because Russian oil was reprocessed in the Ambani oil refineries and then sold to Europe. Okay. Despite all the talk in New Delhi, and you've seen this, Pramod, a lot of people saying, we can go with the United States, we can jump the Russians. And I was at a meeting at the Observer Research Foundation, and they told me this. And I said, if that's the case, why is it that you're buying cryogenic engines for your next generation of rockets from Russia? Because the Americans won't give it to you. In terms of technology, the Russians give technology that the West will not give. So the Russians gave India the BrahMos. And if BrahMos 2 comes through, it'll be a hypersonic missile. So that'll be an interesting thing there. So I think that'll be worth looking at, you know. Pramod, could you kill the photograph of somebody called Olivia Madison, who's joined this? Yeah, thank you. That whoever she is, it looks like we're being attacked by this person. Yeah, it's the Indians can't lose the Russian relationship. So I think that's what you have to keep in mind, okay? And as far as Zelensky's displeasure, the Indians and the Ukrainians don't have a good political relationship. India buys stuff from Ukraine, but the Ukrainians don't accept the Indian position on Kashmir, for example. You know? So I think that is something to look at. I'll take the next question.
Thank you,
Yeah,
sir.
you need to block whoever Olivia Madison
Yes, we
is.
have done that.
Yeah, thank you.
Second is that what are the latest development in NATO's relationship with non-member countries? Do you see the possibility of global NATO emerging where non-NATO members can also be part of this alliance indirectly?
You can talk about it, but what are you going to give the Indians? Or what are you going to give the Filipinos? What are you going to give the Indonesians? People who are non-NATO members. Will you give them technology? See, for there to be a global NATO, everybody has to be able to use the same types of weapons. And I'll give you one example. If you look, Americans, Australians, and Japanese can move from each other's naval ships because they're the same kind of ships, they're the same kind of doctrine, they use the same technologies. Indians can't go on those ships. They can work with them, but they can't work in the seamless way that the Americans and the Japanese work. You would have to give money to people to buy these technologies because look, Philippines, if you talk to the government, it's interested in social welfare. Indonesia, it's interested in social welfare. Malaysia is interested in social welfare. India's defense budget doesn't go above 2%. And that includes the money it spends on pensions. If you want a global NATO, then you have to pay for these countries, or you have to subsidize these countries' arms programs.
Let me move to the next question. There's another question that you said that NATO has been losing one of its biggest assets, that is its soft power. How can NATO win back its soft power or its stand like NATO is because NATO is a military alliance?
It's not just NATO. Look, I'll give you the example of the Dutch. Okay, the Dutch are members of NATO. The Dutch are members of the European Union. But what is important in this is that The Hague, Den Haag, is also the headquarters of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Yet when Gaza happened, the Prime Minister of Netherlands, a guy called Mark Rutte, who's now the Secretary General of NATO, did not go and file a complaint about genocide, violation of human rights at either the ICJ or the ICC. And he could have cycled from his office to the International Criminal Court or the Court of Justice and handed over a complaint. It took South Africa to do it. And there's a long history and reasons why South Africa did what it did. And look at the amount of kudos that South Africa got because it did it. And look at what happened to the EU. All these big names in the EU, Rishi Sunak didn't do anything about Gaza. Macron didn't do anything. And yeah, they built a floating pier. But where has been the European pressure to put on to get a ceasefire? And wait and see how much money you'll need to rebuild Gaza, because we've all seen the photographs. What has Olaf Scholz said? Another country which loves to talk about human rights, rules-based international order. The Meloni, none of these people. And in America, it's worse. Lindsey Graham has been saying the Israelis should be allowed to use nuclear weapons. Now, if you have seen any photographs of Gaza, there are no military installations there. They're below cities. So essentially, if you drop a nuclear weapon anywhere in Gaza, you're committing genocide because you're going to kill a lot of innocent women and children. If Europe wants to get back its soft power, it has to start addressing the issues which it has pushed into the background for its own political military convenience. Because here's the thing with the rules-based international order. 90% of the time it works for you, 10% of the time it doesn't. But when it doesn't work for you, you need to abide by the rules. And this is what Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has said rather eloquently. He said, who came up with these rules? Who agreed to these rules? When are they enforced? Are they enforced universally? And I think your audience can figure that one out pretty nicely.
Thank you, sir. There's another question on, you talk about Indo-Pacific. So how does NATO engage with countries in the Asia-Pacific region? How do you see the future of Indo-Pacific strategy where NATO members have because NATO members have different stand on the US Indo-Pacific strategy?
Look, the Indo-Pacific, despite all the feuds and the differences in the region, go and look at the economic growth taking place. And I'll give you one example. China's trade with ASEAN now is close to $880 billion a year. The next highest is China's trade with the EU, which is $700 billion a year. Next highest is the United States, $600 billion a year. Then Japanese, $300 billion, South Korea, $300 billion. Given these large volumes of trade, then how are people going to walk away from the Chinese and ally with the United States and the West if they're not being offered complementary advantages? And I'll say this, that one of the things the ASEAN countries, who are very good at creating trade arrangements and so on, because these are very smart countries like Singapore, they all go to the Americans and say, you do not give us market access. And the Americans won't give market access because now, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, you have to show how friendly you are to workers. So the US, which pushed for a Trans-Pacific partnership, never entered the Trans-Pacific partnership. To sum this up very quickly, unless you have an economic arrangement which leads to higher levels of growth, equity, etc. in Asia, you cannot have a Asian NATO, because your member will be Japan, which is one of the oldest populations in the world. Good luck with that. Their average fighting age will be 60.
Thank you. Let me move to the next question. We all know there's a question that we all know that yes, Ukraine is a sovereign country, but was it that necessary and emergency to join NATO and keep on waging a war against Russia? What would be the solution for this? Why joining NATO for Ukraine is so important? That is another one question.
Okay.
Another is like you talk about quality and quantity, like the number of the decline of population. So there's a question that thank you for discussing the demographic trend. As far as conscription is concerned, there is indeed a problem with the quantity in recruiting younger cohort. However, are there any efforts regarding the quality of the conscripts, say for instance, the education and health that could make a better military?
Okay. Look, on the first part on Ukraine, there are two parts here. Okay. I am one of those people who believe that the United States' policy towards Ukraine, which essentially drove the NATO policy towards Ukraine, lacks imagination. The Americans, since the end of the Cold War, have kept pushing two things. One is get NATO to keep growing and make it sit on Russia's borders. And a lot of people in America say, imagine if the Russians had put troops in Mexico. Would you like that? And it's the same thing for the Russians. They see it as an existential threat. I'll take the one on why NATO didn't intervene in Gaza. And that's very simply because the US has no interest in really bringing about any strategic restraint there. Okay? And if somebody wants me to elaborate, I'll elaborate. But to get back to the question of India and the US, in India, people are euphoric about how they're going to have defense ties with the United States. Those defense ties are overhyped. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. One is the Indians have been asking now for about 7-8 years for an electromagnetic catapult, which will help them launch planes off the aircraft carrier. The US has shown little interest in transferring that technology. The US will not transfer missile technology. The US has given India an engine for its light combat aircraft, which was built in the 1980s. Now, you can use it for your aeroplanes, but if you want to make a next generation of aeroplanes, you can't. as I've always said, the Indians are focusing on defense. They should focus on the strong points of working with the US. US is the #1 education superpower in the world. Work with the Americans to improve the quality of education in India. Two, work with the Americans to improve the quality of tourism in India. The city of Amsterdam, Pramod, gets 17 million tourists a year. It has a population of 900,000. That's 9 lakhs. India has a population of 140 crores. It gets 11 million tourists, which is essentially 1 crore tourists. You just look at the difference in numbers here. These are the kinds of things that the US can help with. Aviation, the US can help with. Build these areas, if I may. But there's a question on at 75 with cyber attacks fueling fear and division. Will NATO prioritize a united information shield to protect citizens, or will traditional military might remain the top focus? NATO will look for an information shield. NATO looks essentially for protecting the homeland. And protecting the homeland doesn't mean building a lot of fighter aircraft. The big problems are cyber hacking. And as we saw, somebody allegedly claims to be the CCP and is hacking this meeting. And the other one is terrorism, which is a real problem. Homegrown terrorism is a real problem in NATO. These would be the two things that they need to focus on. Okay. I'll take the questions which aren't showing up here. I'm only getting the new messages.
Another was like, can we argue that the post-militarism in Europe is influencing the growing reluctance towards militarization in Europe? That is one of the questions that was shared. And we also have another questions that at 75, with cyber attacks fearing near the division, will NATO prioritize a united information shield to protect citizens, or will traditional military might remain the top focus?
I'm just looking at the one which just came from Nassau. I'll say this. I've answered the cyber question. The real issue for Europe is going to have to start breaking away from the US on security issues. Something that no one in the older generation of people in Europe are willing to do. Because if you look at it politically, Europe and America are two very different beasts. Europe believes in LGBTQ. The American Supreme Court is talking about repealing gay marriage. Now, look at how significant that is for the Europeans. Similarly, the Europeans believe in universal healthcare. The Americans have Obamacare, but they fight tooth and nail. So there's a whole bunch of things here which make no sense. And I'll say this, Europe will never fight outside the confines of Europe, or NATO will never fight outside the confines of Europe, except for doing operations like Libya, which they found difficult to sustain, because young people in Europe say very clearly, I am willing to defend my country. So if you attack Belgium, a Belgian will stand up to fight. But I'm not going to Afghanistan. I'm not going to the Indo-Pacific. I have no idea where Taiwan is. So, and I think that answers the question that Divya Khanna asks about what the post-materialism in Europe is influencing the growing reluctance to its militarization. Yes, Europe believes in environmental issues. Europe believes in the dignity of the individual. These things mean you have to pump money into your society. You can't use it to militarize.
Thank you, sir. We have received lots of questions on Russia, Ukraine, and all. We'll try to avoid that. But let me go to the last question because we are running out of time. Like you just mentioned on Afghanistan. So, what is NATO's stand on the security situation in the Middle East?
There is no stand. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out what is the stand. Has anybody in NATO suggested A, how to bring out a ceasefire, B, what is a two-state solution? And if you can't say that, then you have no stand. You're going to go with whatever comes out of Washington. And Washington, again, it doesn't know how to bring about a ceasefire. There's a lot of talk going on in Qatar between different people for that. And the other thing that's going on is, again, nobody knows how to do a two-state solution. And I'll end by saying this, Pramod. Israel, for a long time, was essentially saying we can look after our own security. But when the Iranians did their missile and drone strike on Israel, the Americans had to put up close to 150 aeroplanes to help the Israelis shoot down what was coming in. So did the British, and so did the Jordanians, by the way. And for the first time in its entire history, Israel had to depend on people from outside. And the Americans were using $500,000 air-to-air missiles to shoot down $20,000 Iranian drones. Now, why am I giving you this detail is the Israelis now realize, one, they are not the masters of their destiny. Two, Netanyahu used to go around the world saying security is our greatest export. Well, anybody who bought that must be rethinking it now. And I'm sure everybody in the audience will agree with me. If Hamas did it once, Hamas can do it again. And I'll end by one important note. 500,000 Jews have left Israel since the war began. And those 500,000 Jews number is not something I cooked up or it came off Al Jazeera or something like that. It came from the Israeli Department of Immigration, okay? Or the Israeli Immigration Authority. So when you make these kinds of statements, you must look for authentic figures and not what somebody's cooking up. This is a real problem for the Israelis because how many of those 500,000 will come back? And if there is a war with Hezbollah, how many more leave? We don't know. So, at the end of the day, what I'm asking for is that NATO needs to stop talking war and start talking about all the things that made Europe a world actor. And by the way, you can tell people to send their Ukraine-Russia questions to me directly. Sure. Do you want me to type in my email address in the chat?
Sure. Please drop your email ID. We still have lots of questions, but maybe due to time question, we have to end it here. But let me take one.
I can go for another 10 to 15 minutes if you like.
So there is a question like South Korean president was invited to the NATO summit to talk about threat from Moscow, Pyongyang. So how NATO can assist on this issue? That is one. And second is that there is a question about second. That's there on WeChat. So there's a question on I'll get it back because I have closed down.
Okay, I'll give you the South Korean one. Look, they're trying to bring people in, like the South Koreans, and the South Koreans did what the Americans asked. They put the THAAD missiles, which are the anti-ballistic missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, in South Korea, despite the objections of the Chinese. The real thing is, look, around the world, I think the lesson of Ukraine is don't give up your nuclear weapons. In the mid-1990s, the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons and they were told, we will defend you. How well has that worked out for the Ukrainians? Now, and by the way, the Chinese signed a treaty where they said if Ukraine is attacked with nuclear weapons, we will defend Ukraine. So that's a very interesting sidebar to all this. I think around the world, people are going to start talking very seriously about nuclear weapons. The Germans are talking about it. The Poles may be talking about it. The Swedes may be talking about it, but you'll never find out. And the Japanese have already started talking about nuclear weapons. The South Koreans may do it because the only way South Korea can make dead sure that it has a guarantee against North Korean nuclear intimidation is to have its own nuclear weapons. And I don't think any South Korean president is that naive and gullible that they're going to believe a NATO guarantee. Let me put it that way to you.
So there is one question that, according to you, how do you think that Russia is going to respond to the ongoing NATO summit, if you have followed their press? Second is that what initiative does NATO have in place for space security? That is second.
Okay. On the Russian side, the Russians are essentially doing working very hard to create an alternative to the West. look at what they've done with BRICS. They've come much closer to the Chinese. They're talking about a currency. Now, in India, there's a lot of, oh, we're not going to join this currency, so on. But you become irrelevant if you don't join the currency, but the Brazilians, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Iranians do, and the UAE. So, I mean, that's one thing to keep in mind there. The second thing is the Russians are getting much closer to the Chinese in terms of tech transfers, investments, so on. And one of the reasons China has become one of the largest or the largest exporter of cars in the world is it now exports to Russia. And again, the Russians will buy Chinese electric vehicles. They won't buy American electric vehicles. And BYD is now beating Elon Musk and Tesla as the producer of the most electric vehicles in the world, even though the Europeans and the Americans have put tariffs on them. So my take is the Russians have worked to make sure that they don't get defeated economically by the West. And they grew 3.5% last year. Does that mean sanctions are working? The Russians have a very smart governor of their central bank, which is their reserve bank, who's done a lot of things which every central banker should learn from. And one of them is to remove the dependence on the West. So sorry, I forgot the last question you asked.
Last question was on space security, like what initiative does NATO have in place for space security? And there's also a question on, I want to add one more question that you mentioned about Europe want to spend on climate change. So what is NATO, how is NATO addressing climate change and its impact on security?
Okay, look, everybody's putting money into space security. But at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that wars are not won in space, wars are won on the ground. Israel had space security. Hamas has nothing. How did that one work? Just to put it in perspective, the Afghans had no space. The United States had all the space in the world. How did that one work? Europe will make space security because it'll be worried about Russian and satellite weapons. So it'll have a redundancy of satellites, especially for their own GPS systems and so on. That makes complete sense. So it's passive defense there. On the environment, look, the Europeans are pushing hard for environment, and the Europeans, you have to give them credit. They put their money where their mouth is. You know this, you've traveled extensively through Europe. See the measures they've taken to reduce carbon footprint. Other countries could learn from them. I mean, now in Europe, if you buy a cup of coffee in the Netherlands, in some places, they will not give you a plastic lid unless you pay for it. Because they say the paper cup we can recycle, the plastic lid is more difficult to recycle. Very small things, but they work in these directions. Denmark has done really good work with wind energy, just to put this in perspective. So and again, that's not NATO doing climate change, that's EU doing climate change. So yes, that's where the Europeans get full marks, to my mind.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. Thank you so much for the interesting discussion. We really learned a lot. We still have lots of questions, but maybe we have to end it here, or maybe we can plan another session in the future. We'd like to request all our audience to follow us on Twitter and subscribe our YouTube channel for the upcoming videos. I, on behalf of NICE and all our audience, would like to thank you for your kind presence and valuable time. We hope to have you in real in Kathmandu in the future. We'd also like to thank our audience for their wonderful question. Thank you so much and have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
As always, a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.